Firstly, thank you to Amy, Charlie and Courtney for the opportunity to present today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm also really enjoying the other speakers' presentations. As you just heard, I'm Javier Gonzalez and I'm from the Centre for Nutrition, Exercise and Metabolism at the University of Bath. Here is a picture of the city of Bath, which is beautiful. It's got Roman and Georgian architecture. The university was built in the 1960s, so is less beautiful, hence why this is the opening slide. And what I'll be talking about over the next 30 minutes is fueling endurance exercise. I'll focus where I can on running, but some of it will be in cycling. I'll start with what's been shown over the last few decades, and then I'll finish with a little bit of what we've recently found. So I'll start with disclosures. If you want to see a comprehensive list, you can see this link. It's available on my profile page on the university website, which also includes funders of my work, but also other potential relevant personal biases that I may have. And probably the main one for today is that I love carbohydrates and I love exercise. And that passion seems to be hereditary because so does my daughter. When we perform exercise, we use energy. We use fuels to support that exercise energy expenditure. And the main fuels we use are carbohydrates and fats. And you can see the proportion of carbohydrates and fats will vary depending on the intensity of exercise. So here you can see going from rest to low intensity exercise, there's an increase in total energy expenditure. And that will be met by different fuel sources. So the white bar at the bottom is the fatty acids circulating in the blood. They're coming from the adipose tissue, the fat tissue being broken down. The light grey is other lipids. That's mainly the fat found within muscle, intramuscular triglyceride. We've then got the darker grey, which is the circulating glucose, mainly coming from the liver in the fasted state, but also maybe from the gut if we've had anything to eat. And then we've got the black, which is muscle glycogen, the storage form of carbohydrate. And you can see that as we increase exercise intensity, we get an increasing reliance on carbohydrate as a fuel, and especially muscle glycogen. So carbohydrates are the predominant fuel during moderate to high intensity exercise. And it's worth noting that 75% of VO2 max, or power max here, that's actually the speed that good amateur runners will run their marathon at. And elite marathon runners might even run faster than that. Elite marathon racing is high intensity if you express it either in absolute terms or in relative terms. You can see world record pace there equates to a high power output if you express it in watts, and elite marathon runners will run that marathon at more than 90% of their VO2 max. So clearly carbohydrates are going to be an important fuel source to support that exercise. Now the downside to carbohydrates is that we can't store very much in the body. We can store carbohydrate as glycogen in the liver, and we can store about 100 grams there, and we can also store some in muscle, about 1 kilo or so. But that's in the muscle all over the body, and only a portion of that is available for use for active muscle during running. So we don't have enough carbohydrate energy to support the demands of running a marathon. The positive side of carbohydrates as a fuel, as I've already shown you, is that they're a rapid burning fuel. So they provide rapid energy, and they also provide energy at a low oxygen cost. So if we're burning carbohydrate as fuel, we can run for the same running speed with a lower oxygen cost, or alternatively, for the same oxygen cost, we can run at a faster running speed. Compare this to fats. Even in a lean athlete, we can store a lot of energy as fat. So about 7 kilos of fat in a lean athlete would equate to more than 60,000 kilocalories of energy. So we have plenty of energy available as fat, but the downside to fat as a fuel is it's a relatively slow burning fuel. And that's partly why it can't support the high exercise intensities. So when we run out of carbohydrate stores and glycogen, that's when we hit the wall and we have to lower the exercise intensity, where fat can then provide that fuel. So this is where nutrition comes in. It's been shown many times that if we ingest carbohydrates during exercise, we can delay the point of fatigue. We can sustain that moderate to high intensity exercise for longer. Here you can see a classic study where they got people to cycle at 70% of their VO2 max, ingesting either water only, which is the open circles that you can see here, and you can see that their blood glucose concentration starts to decline after about an hour, and at the point of fatigue at 3 hours, their blood glucose concentrations reach hypoglycemia. But if they ingest carbohydrate regularly throughout exercise, they maintain their blood glucose concentrations and can exercise for an extra hour longer at that intensity. So going from 3 hours to 4 hours on average. The other thing the carbohydrate ingestion did in this study was it maintained high rates of carbohydrate oxidation. So 2 potential mechanisms by which ingesting carbohydrates during exercise delays fatigue is maintaining blood glucose concentrations and also maintaining high rates of carbohydrate oxidation. Another potential benefit could be sparing glycogen stores. If we're using ingested carbohydrate, then we might be preventing the depletion of the glycogen stores in our liver and in our muscle. To measure this in muscle, it's routinely done in our field to take muscle biopsies and directly measure the glycogen concentration there. That's more difficult with the liver, but it has been done in several studies using MRI scanners that are adapted to perform magnetic resonance spectroscopy. For muscle glycogen, these are data from a running study that we did using the biopsy method. And it's probably relevant to note that in most cycling studies, you don't actually generally see much glycogen sparing. But if you do see glycogen sparing, it tends to happen more often in running. And we found that in this study. So when people ingested carbohydrates regularly throughout this moderate to high intensity running bout, there was almost a 30% reduction in the amount of muscle glycogen that was used compared to ingesting water only. We also ran a study where we measured liver glycogen concentrations, this time during cycling, and we see a profound effect on liver glycogen sparing. So ingesting carbohydrates during exercise has a modest effect on sparing muscle glycogen, but a very strong effect on liver glycogen sparing. So this is another potential mechanism by which ingesting carbohydrates may delay fatigue. So if we're looking to optimize the use of carbohydrates during exercise, then we should really think about the type and the amount of carbohydrate to ingest. And one of the ways in which we might rationalize an approach to doing that is to know how much of the ingested carbohydrate can an athlete actually use and make use of as fuel. One of the methods we use to do this is we might get people to run at a fixed intensity for a 2-hour period, and we get them to ingest a fixed amount of carbohydrate, let's say 90 grams per hour of glucose. And what we do is we add a special type of glucose to the drink, a labeled glucose, where we've added a molecular tag, a bit like a GPS tracking system, and then we can trace the fate of where that glucose ends up. Is it staying in the body, or is it being burned as fuel? And if it's being burned as fuel, it'll appear on the carbon dioxide on the breath that these athletes breathe out. And then we can calculate in grams per hour how much of the ingested carbohydrate has been made available and used as fuel. So using this method, it's been shown over several studies that if you increase the ingestion rate of carbohydrate, so going from left to right, you can increase the amount of ingested carbohydrate that's oxidized. And if that carbohydrate is glucose only, then there seems to be an upper limit of around 60 grams per hour of the capacity to digest, absorb, and metabolize that ingested glucose. It's perhaps also worth noting that, given that it's probably going to be fairly hot tomorrow, that with heat stress, this capacity for ingested glucose oxidation goes down slightly. So it's previously been estimated at about 10%. We've got some unpublished data in a larger sample size that suggests it could be up to 30% of a reduction. So something to perhaps be aware of, and we're now looking at strategies to try and mitigate that. So with glucose ingestion, we get this upper limit of about 60 grams per hour that is available as fuel. And it's thought that the main reason for that is due to a limited capacity to digest and absorb that carbohydrate across the intestine. And the reason goes like this, because at least in theory, the bottleneck for this carbohydrate availability could be any of these points along this chain. So from the capacity to ingest it, to empty from the stomach, to be absorbed across the intestine, the hepatic extraction, delivery and circulation to the muscle, and uptake and oxidation. But we know that we can easily ingest 180 grams per hour of carbohydrate. And if we intravenously infuse glucose straight into a vein, then the muscle will use and oxidize easily 120 grams per hour. When other measurements have been done, it's been shown that the main bottleneck seems to be intestinal absorption of glucose. Now, when glucose is absorbed across the intestine, it does so through a specific transport protein known as SGLT1, a sodium-dependent transport protein. And it's thought to be this that is the rate-limiting step to allow glucose to enter the circulation and be available. Now, what's interesting is that fructose, a different type of carbohydrate, uses a different transport protein known as GLUT5. And so the theory is that if you're trying to get more carbohydrate into the system, you can get more in by making use of two transport proteins rather than one, a bit like this crowd exiting the building through two doors rather than one. The other point to be aware of, though, is that if you're ingesting fructose, most of it doesn't appear in the circulation as fructose. Most of it will get converted into glucose and lactate, and it's those fuels that are then ultimately used by muscle. So when we combine glucose with fructose to ingest during exercise, this is the pattern that we see. We see a higher capacity for ingested carbohydrate oxidation. And the difference there can be up to 30 grams per hour, so a substantial difference. Okay, as a point of reference, I typically infer that about 10 grams per hour of ingested carbohydrate oxidation starts to become biologically relevant, physiologically meaningful. So 30 grams per hour is clearly of benefit. I was also pleased to see that the gels that will be provided tomorrow make use of this technology. You can see dual fuel written on the pack there because it's got glucose and fructose. So that's the what's known. It's known that carbohydrate stores are limited but an important component of optimal endurance performance. And what we can try to do to help those endogenous carbohydrate stores is to ingest exogenous carbohydrate. And if we ingest carbohydrate during exercise, we can spare glycogen, especially in the liver. We can preserve blood glucose concentrations and delay fatigue. And if we want to maximize carbohydrate availability, then combining different types of carbohydrates can improve the maximal rates of digestion, absorption, and oxidation of carbohydrate. So, what have we found in the last few years? Well, one of the areas we've studied a little bit is food form, and that's because the type of carbohydrates that are ingested can be done so in several different formats. Here is an image from the side of the Tour de France where I've done most of my applied work. You can see that the riders would be taking on solids in rice cakes, which are in the foil packets there. They could be taking on gels, which were attaching to bottles containing liquid carbohydrate. So in cycling, but also in running sports as well, athletes might ingest their carbohydrates in liquid form from designed sports nutrition products. They might get their carbohydrates from other liquid forms that aren't designed sports nutrition products. They might be in gel formats. They could be in solid sports nutrition products. Or they could be in whole foods, such as bananas, or even more complex food structures, such as a sandwich with a bit of protein and fat there as well. So the question is, does it matter whether we ingest carbohydrates in these different formats in terms of the capacity to make use of that carbohydrate? Well, this question is very much open. It's a very difficult thing to test, partly because of that tracer labeling technology I mentioned earlier. Okay, the problem with trying to measure these things is that you need to get that tracer incorporated into the carbohydrate within the food. That's easy to do in a drink, but much more difficult in something like bread, where you need to produce the wheat that's intrinsically labeled with that protein, and that's prohibitively expensive. There's other potential issues with technical issues with the study design of that method. If you're interested in understanding more about the specifics of this isotope tracing method, a colleague of mine, Andy King, and I wrote this paper a few years ago. And yeah, you can read more about it there. We go into more detail about also understanding blood glucose fluxes, hence the title, where we use some intravenous infusion technology. And you can see an example of what that looks like in the lab there. But we have a little bit of evidence on this idea of whether food form matters. There are 3 studies that I'll present in sequence here. The first one was an earlier study comparing liquid with gel formats of carbohydrate, ingesting about 108 grams per hour of carbohydrate in total. And you can see the difference between those 2 conditions is about 1 gram per hour, so very little difference, probably not biologically relevant. That's good news. You can ingest your carbohydrates as either liquid or gel formats. Another study compared liquid with solid carbohydrates, ingesting about 90 grams per hour of carbohydrate. Again, very little difference between the liquid and the solid format. And then more recently, we compared several different formats of carbohydrate and also a mix and match approach at higher carbohydrate intakes of 120 grams per hour. And that's because certainly in the last 5 to 10 years or so in cycling, but also in ultra running, people are starting to really push the boundaries of the upper limit of carbohydrate intake. And 120 grams per hour now is relatively common. Again, we found very little difference in the exogenous or ingested carbohydrate oxidation rate between the different conditions. So at least when designed sports nutrition products are used that are generally low in fats and low in fiber, then it doesn't seem to matter too much the physical form in which we ingest those carbohydrates. Another question we might have then is how much carbohydrate should a specific athlete ingest? And these are the generic guidelines provided by the American College of Sports Medicine. You can see that depending on the intensity and duration of exercise, there are some specific carbohydrate targets that are provided. But one thing we noted was that these targets in 30 to 60 grams per hour or up to 90 grams per hour don't take into account the body size of the athlete. If we look at recovery guidelines, they're often expressed in grams per kilogram of body weight per hour. Here it's just in grams per hour. And if you look at athletes, you can get athletes in many endurance sports of drastically different body sizes. We might have a cyclist of 85 kilos and another one down at close to 50 kilos. And the question is whether the larger athlete can make use of more ingested carbohydrate and should be provided more or not than the smaller athlete. So we set out to answer this question relatively recently. And what we found was that when we provided a range of athletes with the same amount of carbohydrate, so they were all provided 90 grams per hour at the same exercise intensity, the larger athletes could burn more of the ingested carbohydrate than the smaller athletes. So on the x-axis here, we've got estimated body surface area as an idea of the athlete body size. The same relationship holds whether you express it as body mass, as fat-free mass, or as height. So any of these markers of body size show the same relationship. The larger the athlete, the greater the capacity to digest, absorb, and use carbohydrate. And remember that I previously mentioned that 60 gram per hour cap on glucose, oxidation of ingested glucose during exercise. You can clearly see a number of athletes above that previously thought upper limit. Now, body size still probably isn't the only factor to consider here. You can see that at a given body size, there's still a large range in the capacity to oxidize ingested carbohydrate. One athlete there down at 30 grams per hour and another one up at 60 grams per hour for the same body size. So body size is potentially one factor, but not the only factor. So how can we further personalize the approach to ingesting carbohydrates during exercise? One thing we could do is do a whole series of studies trying to understand the determinants of this capacity and develop prediction models, maybe with the help of Barry, to optimize the prediction of whether someone can make use of the ingested carbohydrate. Or we could take a lazier or perhaps more efficient approach, which is what we did in a more recent study, where we could directly measure the capacity of an individual athlete and base the recommendation on that. So what we did in this study, and for context again, in the black circles, we've got all of the prior literature on glucose ingestion during exercise. On a first trial, we got the athletes to ingest 90 grams per hour. That's the solid red dot. And the ingested carbohydrate oxidation rate fits perfectly on that line of best fit with prior literature. Based on the measurement in that athlete, we then provided them with a personalized dose. So if they only oxidized 60 grams per hour, then they were provided with a lower dose of carbohydrate during their second trial. So the open red circle represents the average, the group average for the personalized dose. And you can see that you can then achieve the same ingested carbohydrate oxidation rate as they would have achieved when they all consumed 90 grams per hour, but this time many of the athletes are consuming much less than 90 grams per hour, and on average it's 65 grams per hour. So it's a more efficient way to make use of carbohydrate during exercise. It's 11 grams per hour higher, the ingested carbohydrate oxidation rate, than we would have predicted based on that line of best fit from prior literature. So we think that's biologically relevant. And of course, because the athletes are ingesting less carbohydrate, then there's less potentially sitting in the stomach and causing gastrointestinal discomfort. And indeed, when we asked them to report gastrointestinal symptoms, these were lower in that personalized dose trial. So this provides some proof of concept of this approach of measuring ingested carbohydrate oxidation in an athlete and providing a personalized prescription based on that. So my take-home messages would be that the type and amount of carbohydrate can be manipulated to achieve a specific athlete's goals and depending on their race conditions. The personalizing of a fueling plan may need to consider additional factors, one of which we think is body size, but there's also probably others as well. And until we develop a model like that, one of the alternative ways to approach this could be to directly measure an athlete's capacity to absorb and use ingested carbohydrate and base our approach on that. That just leaves me to thank you for your attention and also thank all of the collaborators and colleagues I work with at Bath and further afield. Thank you.
Fantastic stuff. We have time for a few questions. So would anybody like to ask a question? There's one over there.
Thanks, Harvey. It was great. Do you have any sense for the difference between cycling and running and why that is? It's a question that's plagued me for a while, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so there are theoretically at least several differences between running and cycling that could influence some of the practical guidelines on carbohydrate intake. A main one, I think, is the mechanical action of running, the bouncing up and down of the stomach and the intestine. There haven't been many measurements of things like gastric emptying during running compared to cycling. There are a few studies that have measured things like ingested carbohydrate oxidation rate directly comparing cycling and running, and they find very little difference. But clearly, the reporting of symptoms during running is much higher than in cycling, so there are definitely differences there. I'm keen to study it more. There's only, of the slide I presented which compared glucose with glucose-fructose mixtures, all of those studies, bar one, were done in cycling. So we did do a study where we did running and compared glucose with glucose-fructose, and it was reassuring to see that you still see the effect of glucose-fructose versus glucose only. So clearly the recommendation to combine multiple types of carbohydrates, that still holds with running, but certainly the amounts to ingest should probably be lower than what is recommended for cycling, partly due to the symptoms that were reported. And as I say, I think the most likely explanation is just the mechanical action of bouncing up and down. Potentially, there could be more heat stress in running than in cycling because there's less airflow, for example. And because that affects exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, there could be some interactions there too. So there's several potential factors, but I think mechanical is probably a key one.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Do you think for the personalized fueling, there's day-to-day variability within an individual, like context around what they've been eating beforehand, and if so, it's significant enough to affect what you would give them recommendation-wise?
Yeah, so it's a really good point. So whenever we're thinking about personalization or individual responses, we need to be wary of the variation we see day to day within a single individual. In our data for the measurements, and that will vary by the measurement we take as well. So for ingested carbohydrate oxidation rates, it's quite reassuring actually that seems pretty consistent day to day within an athlete. And so it's certainly, in that final study I showed, that 11 grams per hour is well above what we see in terms of day-to-day fluctuations, but it's a really important point. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Javier. Have you noticed any sex differences, either from a lab study point of view or from an anecdotal applied practice point of view?
Yeah, so certainly in terms of what I've presented here, that capacity to digest, absorb, and oxidize carbohydrate doesn't seem to show clear sex differences aside from body size differences. So, yeah, most of that's accounted for by body size, but there do seem to be some differences in nutritional behaviors between the sexes. So it's been shown a number of years ago now that females tend to show less of an increase in muscle glycogen in recovery from exercise, but almost entirely explained by not eating as much carbohydrate as males. So once that's normalized, again, fairly little difference between the sexes there too.